In Austria, being too friendly with strangers can be seen as suspicious or fake. True or false?
True.
In Austria, small talk is often skipped. People prefer to get straight to the point. True or false?
False.
In Austria, it's common to spend hours sitting in a coffee house. True or false?
True and false.
Hi, and welcome to ASHA Global Voices Podcast. My name is Tjasa Strle, and I'm a cross-cultural leadership coach and the creator of ASHA Global Voice. Together with my guests, we are sharing stories from around the world about different cultures, leadership, and human experiences that connect us. If you like what you hear, please hit the subscribe button. Your support means the world to me. And now, let's dive into today's episode.
Hi, and welcome to ASHA Global Voices Podcast. I'm happy to introduce today's guest, Daniel Ebner, an executive and business coach who supports leaders and teams around the world in building authentic leadership, resilience, and value-driven culture. With experience across industries from startups to global organizations, Daniel brings a strong intercultural perspective shaped by living in several countries across Latin America and Europe. He's originally from Austria and is now based in Munich, Germany. Daniel, welcome. I'm so glad that we are doing this.
Yeah, thank you, Tjasa. Thanks so much for the invitation, for having me, and also for your kind introductory words. Really looking forward to our podcast today and to talk a little bit about Austria.
Yeah, and talking about Austria, let's start with true or false statements. The first one was that in Austria, being too friendly with strangers can be seen as suspicious or fake. And you said that this one is true. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Of course. So Austrians, I would say in general, they appreciate realness and authenticity. And also they have a certain reserved politeness, if that makes sense. So reserved politeness. And they are a bit suspicious when people are in a way exaggerated friendly. So also maybe Austrians are a little bit skeptic by nature. Maybe that's also the case. But if there is, let's say, over enthusiastic behavior, especially in an initial encounter, this can come across as a little bit superficial for us, or maybe even manipulative. So we might question their intention. I would say trust and warmth with Austrians is built gradually over consistency and step by step. So it takes time.
And for example, if I would meet an Austrian on the street and would try to kind of start a conversation with them, would I be seen as not too friendly or a suspicious person? In your opinion, what do you think?
It depends on your behavior. So being approached by another person is not suspicious. It's just how this person behaves. And if you're overly friendly, overly excited, then we might be a little bit suspicious.
Okay,
But
I
you
get
can
it.
totally approach Austrians whenever you see them. Totally. We're happy to be approached by other people.
Thank you for letting us know. And the next one was that in Austria, small talk is often skipped. People prefer to get straight to the point. I think you said that this one is true.
Yeah, no, I said it's false because it depends on how you see it. So it's a little bit compared to what. So let's say, for example, and I know that you already had someone talk from Germany on your podcast, and they said it's false because they really like to go straight to the point and be very efficient. And it's very similar in Austria. However, there is still a little bit of small talk before. So we go quite straight to the point, but not directly to the point. So there might be a little bit of chit chat about the weather, about how the other person is feeling, like how are you today, and these kind of chit chat, like this small talk. So while we do like to go straight to the point, there might be a little bit of interaction before.
Okay, so if I understand correctly, so if, for example, we compare Austrian and Germans, in your opinion, get quicker to the point than Austrians, correct?
Correct. What we're talking about today are tendencies, right? I can also a few Austrians in mind that are quite an exception to what I'm telling you today. But if we compare in general the Austrian and the German culture, and I'm living here in Germany, I would say that yes, so Austrians, they will have a little bit of small talk, but also similar to Germans, they also like to get straight to the point after a small chit chat.
Absolutely. I understand that I'm deliberately asking you because there are these small nuances, right? Even between Germans and Austrians, which is, I think, always great to kind of put out there so that we are aware of. That even between
Absolutely.
cultures that are quite similar, let's say, there are some nuances that are different.
Yeah, I totally agree. Of course, if you compare us, let's say, to Southern European people that definitely spend a lot of time or more time in with small talk and getting to know each other before actually talking business. In this sense, yes, Austrians and Germans might be similar, and we also might prefer to go at some point also straight to the point.
And the third one was that in Austria it's common to spend hours sitting in a coffee house. And you said that this one is true and false.
Yes.
What does that mean?
So it is true for Vienna. So if you're in Vienna and if you have ever been to Vienna, and actually I was just recently in Vienna, there is this coffee house culture, and people might even think of a coffee house as their extended living room. So people they really spend a lot of time there. They go there to read, to meet up with friends and family, and just to enjoy themselves. However, and this is why I said it's false, because this is maybe not the case in the countryside, since there are no these kind of coffee houses as you have in Vienna. So in general, I would say Austrians are very sociable. They really like to spend time with their friends and family. And maybe they go to other places, like let's say in the countryside, it's maybe more the rural, the wine tavern, or maybe it's a bar, it's a restaurant. But if you're asking me, and your specific question was if people spend hours in coffee houses, I would say yes, it's true for Viennese people for sure, and maybe also in some other bigger cities where you have this kind of coffee house culture. However, it is not the case in many places in Austria, which is why I also said it's false. So it's true and false depending on the question.
Sure, makes a lot of sense. Thank you for elaborating it. And I have to also say that, you know, at least the coffee houses in Vienna that I saw are really, really nice. So I can understand why people spend a lot of time there socializing. And tell me now, Daniel, if you had to choose one of the most important things in Austrian culture, what would that be in your opinion?
But it's a very profound question. I would say one thing that Austrians are very proud of is our culture and heritage. So, starting from classical music with Mozart and Haydn and all those great musicians. And then, of course, the beautiful imperial architecture that we have, and then of our regional customs and food. So I think those traditions are still, they're not artifacts. They're still alive today. They're still preserved. They're still celebrated. And you might even see people for those events, for example, wearing their traditional clothes, their traditional outfits called Trachten. And also we have those events like the more fancy events like the Opernball, which is a very nice and also I think a very popular event, maybe even abroad. So I think tradition and heritage is for sure one of the things that where there's a strong connection of Austrians to Austria and their home country. I also think what is important to our culture is social harmony and politeness, and I would say diplomacy. So maybe you're familiar with the Danish term hygge, which is quite popular these days. It's kind of like this coziness. We had this before already, so there was already something that we used, which is called Gemütlichkeit. So the Austrians, we really highly value Gemütlichkeit, is this sense of comfort and harmony and this relaxed togetherness. So it could be both in the social and in the business life. And we might even try to avoid conflict and aggressive behavior. We like harmony, and we like respectful interactions with each other.
Okay, so harmony within relationships is really important to us.
Yes, absolutely. And one more thing comes to mind, and this might be actually similar to Slovenia. We really appreciate nature and the quality of life. So many people, they really like to spend time outdoors. They use those beautiful mountains, the lakes, and then all the beautiful landscapes that we have. So these outdoor activities, I feel like it's also a way of life for many people in Austria, and we really appreciate and we really value those. Yeah, we really value our nature, and that means that we spend a lot of time outdoors.
And tell me, if you would have to choose, what three characteristics would you use to describe Austrians best?
That is also a very good question. It's not easy to say. And as you already mentioned before, there might be nuances, right? So I think if you meet Austrians and you ask me what would happen if you meet an Austrian, if you approach an Austrian, I think Austrians in the beginning, they might be a little bit reserved and a little bit private in the beginning, but always still well-mannered and polite. Because in general, Austrians, I think they tend to be very polite and even a little bit formal in initial interactions. So it takes some time to really build trust and openness with Austrians. And as I said before, if there's an exaggerated display of emotion or maybe oversharing, this can be seen as a little bit irritating or maybe even intrusive. So I think this is one. Then another one would be punctuality, reliability. This is very important to Austrians. So it's a sign of respect to be on time. We value deadlines and appointments. And we see reliability as a sign of professionalism. So we really want to rely on other people, but also we want other people to be able to rely on us. And then there's one thing that I realized when people from outside Austria came to visit me in Austria is their observation that Austrians are very structured and very orderly. So there's this sense of order. People always said whenever they came to visit that it's very clean everywhere and everyone seems to be very organized and very structured. And I think that also kind of like stands for our culture, that we are quite structured and very organized.
So being a little bit reserved at the beginning, then you value punctuality, and also Austrians in general are really structured and organized. And you also mentioned something about emotions, and I have to ask you now, what's your kind of view on Austrians and emotions? Are emotions kind of appropriate, let's say, in business settings?
Yeah, very good question. I mean, of course, emotions are always appropriate. Or
Yeah,
maybe
no,
not always. So maybe it depends on it. Maybe it depends on the context and the setting. Yes, it's not easy to answer this question. So I think especially when you meet someone or in a professional setting, maybe a oversharing or display of emotion is not wanted or is not very welcome. However, once you build a relationship, once you build the trust, of course you can also show emotions, but compared maybe to other cultures, to other countries, we have this kind of like this we are maybe a little bit reserved in the beginning, and it takes some time to build trust with us. But once the trust is there, we are very warm people. We also have emotions, of course. We share our emotions, but it takes some time for us to build this trust, that we are able to do that, but also for other people to share their emotions with us, I would say.
I understand. Austrians also have emotions. Noted.
Absolutely.
Okay, of course, but as I know you are aware of, we are different, our cultures are different, and some are more expressive with their emotions, some less, and it's okay as it is. We are not judging on this podcast. Daniel, I also want to ask you, is there anything Austrians prefer not to discuss, be it in social or business setting?
Yes. So one thing that we don't necessarily want to discuss is money or personal income. So this is something, it's considered inappropriate unless there's a specific reason for it, but otherwise we would not really talk about money or our income. And also, especially if you meet Austrians for the first time, I would not recommend to dive right into talking about topics like political extremes or critical views on Austrian national identity. And also, I would avoid using World War II as an icebreaker. It does not mean that you cannot talk with Austrians about all those topics. But again, it just needs some time to warm up, to build trust, and then you can talk about everything you want. But if it's right in the beginning of building the relationship and getting to know each other, then maybe those are the topics that I would not recommend to use to break the ice.
So interesting that you pointed out talking about money. I was thinking in my head, it's similar in Slovenia, also Slovenians, they don't like to discuss things around money or paychecks. But just to add, I think it would be really valuable for all of us to talk about money and, paychecks, because I think in general it's great so that you have kind of an overview what, for example, your colleagues in similar industries earn. So it's also better for people to negotiate then their paychecks. So I have to admit that I sometimes ask Slovenians just for the sake of, kind of pushing the limits a little bit.
Yeah, and I know what you mean, and I totally agree in regards to transparency. So what we have in Austria is actually by law, if you have a job opening and you advertise for a job, you have to include the minimum salary that you're offering. So of course, this does not mean that there's like 100% transparency, because this is not necessarily the salary that you can really expect, but at least you have an idea of what the minimum salary is. And this is by law. So all the companies, they have to tell you what you can at least expect if you apply for a certain role.
Oh, yeah, that's absolutely great. I think we are getting there. So for us, it's even more challenging, I think, in general, if we are not talking about money. So yeah. And tell me, Daniel, I know you already mentioned that Austrians also like outdoor activities. You have beautiful nature as well. So how would you describe the Austrian approach to work-life balance, in your opinion?
So people definitely spend a lot of time outdoors. In summer, they go hiking. In winter, they go skiing, and all the other activities that there are. And for sure, Austrians really enjoy work-life balance outdoors. And in general, I think they have a strong focus on work-life balance. I think they are very committed during work hours. So they are committed to their job, but also they appreciate if they have some time off. So one thing, for example, is interesting for me now, living in Germany, is one difference that there is in Austria, which is that many companies, people don't work Friday afternoons, for example. So Friday it's called a short week, or it's a short work day, and people already go home during lunchtime, which means that they have already Friday afternoon off and then the weekend. In Germany, it's rather normal that in most companies, people would work on a Friday as they would work all the other days during the week. And then one thing that is also maybe common in other countries as well, but particularly for Austria, it's true that in Austria, the stores and shops, most of them are closed on Sundays, which means Sunday is really time for family, time for friends, time for outdoor activities, and not to go shopping or do business or whatsoever. So we really do value our work-life balance, and we also try to get the cut between our commitment to work, but then also time to relax and enjoy ourselves.
To hear that. And tell me now, if we move to the communication side, are Austrians, in your opinion, more direct or indirect in business communication compared to German?
I would say definitely more indirect and more diplomatic than Germans. So I think both cultures, they value clarity. However, I think Austrians, they communicate with a little bit more nuance, and they often use more indirect language, maybe also to avoid confrontation. So to give you an example, a German might say, "This is wrong." An Austrian might say, "I see it a bit differently." So the meaning is similar, but how we deliver it is much more softer. Let me give you another example. Austrian, if someone shares their opinion, an Austrian would say, "This is interesting." It's not necessarily appraisal that they really think that you said something interesting. It might actually mean that they disagree with what you're saying. So this is also where you have to understand the Austrian culture to put it into context. When we say that's interesting, it doesn't necessarily mean that we agree with what you're saying.
So less direct in communication than Germans. I also, when I was introducing you at the beginning, I said that you lived in Latin America as well. So if I ask you now, comparing Austrian communication style in comparison to some of the Latin cultures, how do you see the difference there?
Yeah, very good question. So I used to live in Mexico and Colombia and Peru, and people there are for sure more open and more outgoing when it comes to communication. As I mentioned before, Austrians, they are more reserved. You don't really find that in that extent, or it's actually almost not present in Latin American people. So they would be immediately talking about, maybe even sometimes oversharing. They are very emotional, they are happy to share their emotions. And so I would say that there's a big difference in how they communicate, of course. So they are much more open to express themselves and to share with each other, to build trust. It takes much shorter time in Latin American countries to build trust with other people than it might take in Austria or in Germany, for example. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, but also, if you remember, I'm curious, also, let's say, giving critical or negative feedback. or let's say constructive feedback. Austrians, we said, are a little bit more indirect than Germans. But if you compare now Austrians to, let's say, Colombians, in your opinion, or Mexicans, would you say Austrians are more direct in giving critical feedback than Colombians or Mexicans?
I would say so, yes. So I think that people here tend to be more direct. However, we do have some nuances. I always say maybe it's because we are closer to Southern Europe and to the Latin culture than Germany, because I feel like it's similar, but of course to a much stronger approach here in Austria, that we are more direct in our communication and the way that we give feedback.
Yeah. And tell me, Daniel, how would you describe leadership in Austrian companies? As more hierarchical or collaborative? Or you can also compare it to Germany.
I think it's changing a lot today. Of course, you have many influences, and we're all working globally. So I think there's a lot of change at the moment as well. I feel in Austria, though, there's still a little bit of this formality, this formal approach, and this structure that I mentioned before that is very important to us. So there is, I think, this, and also these traditional values that I mentioned before. I think they're still very important in today's work life in Austria, especially if we go to the older industries, or maybe the state-owned, the state-influenced sectors. So to one extent, yes, I think it's still a little bit formal. It's a little bit very structured. However, people leader are still very much expected to build consensus and to manage through relationships, and to have this more, to be very approachable and more personable maybe. So I would say it's a mix between finding the balance between a structure and being very rigid, but also being approachable and being personable, and being collaborative.
And if we move to stereotypes now, what would you say it's a common stereotype about Austrian culture that you feel is misunderstood?
I think there are two big misunderstandings. And as you mentioned before, I was traveling to and lived in different countries far away from here, and many don't know Austria. So sometimes when I say that I'm from Austria, they are like it's part of Germany, and sometimes people maybe even think it's Australia. But one of the misunderstandings is that Austria and Germany is the same. So some people, they think, of course we share history, and we are neighbors, and we share language, and maybe even some cultural elements. However, I think there is a little bit of a difference how we behave and in our culture. As I said before, maybe it's because we are a little bit more south, we are closer to the Latin culture, to Southern Europe. I feel like Austrians in general, they are a little bit more relaxed. I feel their humor is a little bit different. So I think we are using a lot of irony when we talk to each other, and when we make jokes and humor, and we might be a little bit more relationship oriented than Germans. So you could even say that we have the best of both worlds, kind of like we have the influence from Germany, the German efficiency, so to speak, but then we also have this humor. We call it Schmäh in our dialect, which is this dry wit, which is a lot of using irony. So yeah, sometimes people might expect this straightforwardness from us, but in the end, we are actually sometimes very indirect, and we make a humor that is not easy to understand if you're not part of this culture. And one more, sorry if I may. Yeah, one more. And this actually relates a little bit back to the beginning when you asked me about the coffee house culture. So I think another big misunderstanding is that since Austria is a small country, all of Austria is the same. And sure, we are a small country, but there is a lot of diversity just within a small distance. So we have different dialects, we have different accents, we have different regional cuisine and traditions, and we even have different climate depending on where you are, if you're in the mountains or if you're in the flat part of Austria. So I would say that this is a big misunderstanding. Also, sometimes here in Germany, when people try to fake Austrian accent, they would speak Viennese. But how people, for example, speak in the very western part of Austria is actually much more similar to Swiss German than to the German that you would speak in Vienna, this kind of German, or the German that you speak where I'm originally from, in the south of Austria. Sometimes even if you move from one valley to the other, so just maybe by car, half an hour, people already have maybe a different accent when they speak. They have a different dialect. So this is, I think, one misunderstanding is that Austria is basically the same. which is not. I think we have a lot of very different and diverse culture and traditions in different regions in Austria.
Great that you pointed out this. I can relate it similar in Slovenia as well. And tell me, Daniel, what advice would you give to someone starting to work with Austrians for the first time? Like one top advice.
One top advice would be to understand the business etiquette, to be formal, to be respectful, and also to be patient at the start. As I said before, Austrians sometimes need some time to build trust and build a relationship. And there's one very specific topic about Austria, which is I recommend using proper titles. So titles is something very important in Austria. And I mean academic titles or sometimes those honorary titles. And this is something that is very specific to Austria, I feel like. Even if you compare it to other German-speaking countries like Germany and Switzerland, it is very specific to Austria. And there are certain reasons why it is like this. Do we have time to dig a little bit
Absolutely.
deeper? Because to me, this is such an interesting topic. When you, especially in business context or in a more formal context, people use a lot of titles in Austria. Even, for example, on a business card, you would see the title of a person, and on a doorbell maybe. And this is not the case necessarily that frequently here in Germany or in Switzerland. And this is actually coming from the Habsburg monarchy. Back then, because the Habsburg, they invested a lot of time in their civil service sector. However, they were not always in a position to reward their civil servants financially, which is why they rewarded them with titles. And this is actually still the reason why it's very much ingrained in Austrian culture that people use titles a lot. So it could be that if you are addressing a person and you are not mentioning their title, they would remind you that they have a title. It's not out of arrogance. It's just something that is very much ingrained in our culture. It's, of course, changing these days now, and people are much more relaxed. But if it's a very, very business, a very formal context, then it could be that people still really want you to use their titles. And even if they introduce themselves, it would be that they introduce themselves with their title first.
Really, really interesting. Thank you for pointing this out. So just for example, if Daniel, you would be a doctor of something. So you would also introduce yourself to me. Hi, I'm Dr. Daniel Ebner.
Exactly, very much so. And there's also something that I find very funny. It's not that common anymore, but it used to be. So I even remember it happened in the village where I'm from. So there was a doctor. So this person really went to university. They received a title because they had an academic degree as a doctor. And back then, in former times, you could marry a title. You could get a title through marriage. So because his wife, she was also called doctor by the people. She was not a doctor, but because she was the wife of the doctor, people would call her doctor. It's not very common anymore, so it's not happening anymore. But I remember, so let's say like 20, 30 years ago, this is something that still happened, at least in some parts of the country.
I think it's a really, really great advice. So if we are starting to work with Austrians or we want to do business with them and we encounter someone who is introduced or we see on his signature also using doctor or any other title, we will make a good first impression when, let's say, meeting in person or online, we address this person by the title as well. It's really great advice that probably a lot of people don't know.
Yeah, I think, as I said, I think it's very specific to Austria. And also maybe it's important to mention that we have an informal and a formal way to speak to each other. So it's like in many different languages, there is like a formal way to address people and an informal way. And usually in the business context or in a more formal context, you would always start with the more formal way of communication. Once a person introduces themselves and they say, hey, my name is, and they say their first name, then this is the sign that it's fine to speak on an informal basis, per du, as we say in German. Otherwise, it is better to stick to the formal way and then also to use the titles. Once you're on an informal basis, you don't need to use titles. You don't need to use the formal way to speak to each other.
Okay. Thank you for elaborating this. And also, I know that in the past in Austria, you've been an HR director. And now I'm curious, in your opinion, what are the key ingredients for a successful, or I'm even more curious, healthy corporate culture?
Very, very good question. I try to be precise because I think there's a lot of things that are important when we talk about how to build a successful and a healthy corporate culture. So I think one for sure is clarity of purposes and values. So people really need to know what your organization stands for and where you want to go with your organization. And it has to go beyond profit. So who are we as an organization and where do we want to go? And this really helps people to create alignment. It helps to create meaning because that's what people want, right? People, they really want to have a purpose and they want to have a meaningful job and task. So first is clarity of purpose and values. The second that is very important is psychological safety. So when people feel safe to speak up, when they feel safe to make mistakes and fail and ask questions, this is really where an organization can thrive and be innovative. And then, of course, what is very important is the leadership behavior, because culture is very much shaped by the role models, which are the leaders. How are they living by the values? How are they modeling their whole approach to business, maybe? So how do they tolerate? How do they model? How do they reward people? And this is not just because so many times, right, you see that their values are written on a website. And that's nice to have, and that's a great first step. But you really need to live by those values and you need to lead by those values. You have to be the example for the whole organization. And culture is not something that you just write on a website. You really have to bring them to life. And the tricky thing about our culture, I would say, is, culture is always there. The question is, how can you shape culture and how can you positively influence it and intentionally shape it? Because shaping a culture is not an easy task. It could be that you do something today, right? You initiate something, you start something today, but you won't see the effects on the organizational culture, on the culture of the company until weeks later. But then maybe you do something wrong and you see the effects immediately. So culture is just something that's very present. It's always present. It's ever changing. So it's important to try to shape culture intentionally.
Yeah, I think this is really important. As you said, ongoing process, but really shaping it intentionally. Great. And I know that you're also a business and executive coach. What are some of the biggest challenges leaders face?
That's a big question. I would say, especially during those times, when there's a lot of uncertainty and changes, I think it's always important to be able to navigate ambiguity and complexity, because the challenge here is that leaders are often expected to provide clarity to their team, even if they themselves, they don't have clarity and they don't have the answers and they cannot predict the future. So there's pressure, of course, that's maybe from top down, and then there's pressure from bottom up. And then there's also pressure on your level of other leadership peers, because also you want to perform well in comparison to them. So what is really important, or what is one of the biggest challenges, I think, is really to deal with the uncertainty and with the complexity sometimes. Then second challenge is balancing performance and people. So you have to drive results as a leader, but also you have to be empathetic, you have to be emotionally intelligent, and you have to be connected with your team. So you need to care, but also you have to set boundaries. I think setting no boundaries is one of the worst things that you can do as a leader. This also means, setting boundaries also means that you have to be consistent and consequent in what you're doing. You have to be consequent and consistent in your leadership, which also means that you have to make unpopular and hard decisions sometimes. And this is the difference between being nice versus being kind and being human. So I think that's the second challenge. And the third challenge would probably be to stay true to yourself. So with all the things that are going on, with all the pressure that you have, with all the uncertainty, it's sometimes really difficult, or it can easily happen that you lose sight of who you actually are as a leader and what you want to achieve as a leader, right? So there are so many different expectations from many different directions. You have to make sure that your team is happy. You have to make your leaders happy. You have to make the company happy. You have to achieve the goals and so on. So in the end, what is sometimes left out is the question, what actually makes you as a leader happy? What do you need as a leader to be effective and to grow? And this is one of the things that I try to do in my coaching, is to really help leaders to reflect and to reconnect maybe even with their leadership identity and with their own values, and understand their strength and their personal long-term vision and how they actually can grow and become even better leaders step by step and over time.
Amazing. And actually, you read my mind because I kind of wanted to ask you now about coaching and what coaching brings to leaders. As you mentioned, it's often challenging being a leader. And what coaching brings to leaders, not just leaders, to everyone that tries coaching, is really helping navigate all this that is happening. But yeah, feel free to share even more what kind of values coaching brings to leaders.
Yeah, I think there's a few things that coaching can really bring as a value to leaders. So one would be for sure clarity and focus. So coaching can really help you to find the structure, to prioritize, to cut through all the noise, to all the uncertainty, to really understand what is really important at that point of time. I also think that coaching can really act as a sounding board. So this space, this judgment-free, neutral space where you can really open up, where you have someone listening to you, to your challenges, to your problems, and a space where you can really be vulnerable, where you can openly share. Self-awareness, I think, is a strong one. So self-awareness, and based on that, the growth. So you can really help others. So as a coach, you help others to gain insights in how they show up and what drives their behavior, but also what might be getting in their way and how they can actually achieve what they want to achieve. And another important topic is for sure confidence and resilience. Leaders have to be confident in what they're doing, but also they need to have this feeling of being supported and also to understanding their own strength. Like, what are their natural strengths to achieve something, and what are their capabilities so that they can actually ultimately lead more authentically and sustainably, ideally. And maybe also it's important to understand sometimes. So what coaching can also do is to really help you understand what are the steps actually that I can take in my development, right? Understanding what is needed, like where am I today, what is needed to get to the next stage or to the next point or wherever I want to move. How can I overcome those hurdles, and how can I maybe solve a conflict that I have with other people? So it really helps you also to shift perspectives. Right? Sometimes we are very much in our own world. We have our way of thinking, and so coaching can really help to challenge your assumptions and your perspectives.
For sure, I agree with you completely, Daniel. I think we are both big advocates for coaching. I also feel like it's important to say for those who don't know exactly what's coaching, that it's also really action oriented. So everything that you said, gaining awareness and so many insights about yourself, being supported, being able to be vulnerable. And really, yeah, I also feel like really having a dedicated hour or 30 minutes, someone being there with you completely present, where you can kind of gain more clarity and then set actionable steps for yourself. I think this is just invaluable. So amazing. And tell me, Daniel, having worked in international settings and traveled extensively, what Austrian trait or characteristic do you notice most in yourself when interacting with people from different cultures?
That is a very good question. That is a very good question. I remember actually once I was traveling abroad. I was in Latin America, and there were other people from all over the world. And one of them approached me, and they said, and until then I didn't even realize that this is something that is so special about how I approach other people. But they told me, so what they said was, I actually realized what your superpower is. And I was like, okay, so I have no idea. Like, well, what do you think is my superpower? And they said diplomacy. And I think it's not just something that I have, but I think something that Austrians actually do have. So I do think that we have a certain sense of diplomacy when we approach other people and when we approach challenges even. So there's something that I like to call when it's about problem solving, I like to call it the cracked window approach. Is some people want the window open, some people want the window closed. So the Austrian solution would be to find a way to make both sides happy. So you crack the window a little open. And I feel like Austrians are very diplomatic in their approach, how they approach other people, how they deal with problems that they have, or with challenges that they have. And in dialogues, they're always they try to find common ground, and they always try to achieve something that is good for both sides, which can be very frustrating because, of course, it takes much longer sometimes. But Austrians, I think in general, and this is something that I noticed myself at some point, especially after I was told that this is something apparently that they noticed, was that being diplomatic can really help you to build relationships in every culture.
Absolutely. Great superpower to have, Daniel. And tell me, what's the most valuable personal insight or skill you've developed through your experiences working internationally and traveling to different countries?
Another big question.
It's a big podcast, Daniel.
Yeah, it's a big podcast. I'm not sure how much time we have, but let me try to think about a few things. So first, I would say humility and curiosity. So living abroad and working abroad and traveling abroad, it really taught me that my way for sure is not the only way, right? So often, and maybe not even the best way. So I really got to break out of my own bubble, like this white man living a very privileged life in a first world country. I was volunteering as a teacher where some of my students, they lived in slums, and I saw poverty and I saw people trying to get by day, not having access to the things that we all take as granted, right? A roof over our head, drinking water, food, access to medical care and support. So maybe I would like to add humbleness. I think it really humbled me, and having this privilege to not just travel, but also to live in different countries and to meet people from all over the world and building beautiful friendships and relationships. This really makes me grateful, but it also humbles me at the same time. And another thing that I would like to add is for sure adaptability and openness. So I learned to listen deeply, try to understand other people, to observe those cultural differences, to also maybe question sometimes my own assumptions. And especially and this is especially important, I think, when you're navigating these unfamiliar environments, right? So being open to new experiences, different cultures, and being pushed outside your own comfort zone. I think it's so important from time to time because it really helps you to become more grounded. And definitely it helps you to become more self-aware as a human being. And this definitely helped me to become the person who I am today.
Beautiful insights, Daniel, and also very useful skill being adaptable. And tell me now, I have to ask you the last question. If you could imagine a better world to live in, what would that look like for people globally?
That's actually, I mean, it's just a question alone could be a whole different episode to fill. But let me try to think of a few things here. So I think at the moment, many things feel like they're going south, right? Things are getting worse. And let's be honest, especially in the current timeline that we are in, it really might feel like this. And it's okay to sometimes feel overwhelmed and to feel like things are getting worse. But I hope it's okay. There's two books that I would like to recommend to the audience. I'm not sure if that's okay, but there's two books that I found they really helped me to also gain some kind of optimism and hope. So there's one book, it's called Factfulness by Hans Rosling. It's very much based on statistics, right? Because many times we think that things are getting worse, right? So, there's this fear of terrorism and all these things. But what Hans Rosling does in his book, he's actually showing and he's proving with statistics, so with data, he's showing that things are actually getting better, much better than we sometimes think. Because of course we are, there's only good news is only bad news is good news. So that sometimes what we consume a lot is bad news, but actually there's a lot of good news. And that's also why I would like to recommend another book. It's called Humankind by Rutger Bregman, a Dutch philosopher. And both of them brilliant books, and both of them, they are providing evidence that things are actually getting better and humans are actually kinder than we sometimes really expect them to be. And to me, it really helped to gain a new optimism, let's say, and hope that things are actually going into the right direction. Besides reading those books, and back to your question, I think there, as cheesy as it sounds, in my ideal world, I think we have to start with kindness and with fairness. So being kind to each other, considerate to each other, helping each other, and also sharing with those that are less fortunate. So we are very privileged, right? We are living a very privileged life, but what can we also do to support others? And also in my ideal world, people would have the same support, the same opportunities. They should be able to love whomever they want to love. They should have enough food. They should have a roof over their head, access to education, medical support. So, well, in other words, to answer your question, I think it would be a kind and a fair world. Saying this, I also understand this is a bit of a utopia, to be honest. But I guess if we all do our fair share, and if we all ask ourselves, what can we as individuals do different, and what can we change for the better, maybe not just for ourselves, but also for the people around us, then I think we're already making a big step forward to making this world a better place. We only have this one, so let's make this one a better place, step by step, like building trust with Austrians.
Absolutely amazing, Daniel. Step by step, as you said, and I would most definitely like to live in your world, and maybe someday it will become a reality, or even at least we will get closer to it. Thank you so much, Daniel, for everything, for all your insight, for everything that you shared with us. It has been an absolute pleasure, and I wish you all the best on your journey.
Likewise. Thank you so much. My best wishes for you. Thank you so much for having me and for giving me this time today and this opportunity to talk about Austria, something that I'm very passionate about, of course. And so I really appreciate this opportunity to tell you and your audience a little bit more about us Austrians, how we work, how we tick, how to approach us, and how to work with us best together. Thank you so much, Tjasa, for this opportunity. It was such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your thoughtful questions. Really appreciate it. And I wish you all the best. Thank you.
Thank you.